The restaurant on Bloor Street had a rule that everyone in Toronto seemed to understand without being told. If you couldn't afford the menu, you didn't belong there. Theodore Marsh had eaten at the same corner table every Thursday evening for 11 years. Same seat, same order. The Atlantic salmon with the lemon caper sauce, a glass of burgundy, sparkling water. The staff knew him by name. They knew he preferred the lights dimmed slightly on the left side. They knew not to interrupt him while he read. What no one expected, on a Thursday in late October, was the small figure who pushed through the heavy glass door and stood in the entrance, looking around the room with wide, serious eyes. She was perhaps 10 or 11, dressed in a too large gray hoodie that had once been white, jeans that stopped 2 inches above her ankles and sneakers held together at the toe with a strip of electrical tape. Her dark hair was pulled back in an uneven ponytail. She had the careful stillness of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. The maitre d' moved toward her immediately. Everyone in the room watched without appearing to watch. She didn't flinch. She looked past him, scanned the room once more, and then her eyes landed on Theodore. She walked straight to his table. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was quieter than he expected, but it didn't waver. "Are you eating alone?" Theodore Marsh was 61 years old. He had built a logistics company from a single warehouse on the outskirts of Kingston into a national operation that employed over 4,000 people. He had sat across from prime ministers and pension fund managers and never once been caught off guard. He set down his book. "I am," he said. The girl looked at his table. At the breadbasket, the half-eaten salmon, the empty chair across from him. She looked back at him with eyes that were dark brown and, entirely, uncomfortably direct. "Could I sit with you?" she asked. "Just while I eat something. I won't bother you." The maitre d' arrived at the table with an apologetic expression already arranged on his face. "Sir, I'm so sorry." "Bring her a menu," Theodore said. A silence settled over the nearest tables. The girl sat down. Her name, he learned, was Adese. "Ada," she said. The way people say a name they've been shortening their whole life. She had a careful way of speaking, choosing her words like someone who had been misunderstood before and didn't want it to happen again. She ordered the soup and the bread, and when the waiter asked if she'd like anything else, she said no thank you, and folded her hands in her lap. Theodore watched her. She didn't offer explanations. She didn't ask for anything beyond what she'd asked for. She ate slowly, neatly, the way someone eats when they're very hungry, but determined not to show it. "Do you live nearby?" he asked after a while. She considered the question carefully. "I did," she said, "for a while." He didn't push. Something about the way she said it told him the details were not simple, and that she had probably told them too many times, to too many people who hadn't been able to help her. When the check came, she reached into the front pocket of her hoodie and pulled out a handful of coins and a few crumpled bills. She counted them with the kind of practiced speed that comes from having done it often in public. She came up short. Not by much, $3 and some change, but she looked at the amount on the table, and her jaw tightened in the particular way of someone swallowing something they weren't going to say out loud. Theodore handed the waiter his card. "You didn't have to do that," Ada said. "I know." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it the way people mean it when they're not used to receiving things. He asked because he wasn't sure what else to do, where she was going after this. She looked out the window at Bloor Street at the dark evening and the October cold pressing against the glass. "I'll figure something out," she said. That was when he understood. He had grown up in a house that was never warm enough in winter, in a small town 2 hours north of Ottawa, where money was something other families had. He had spent one winter, at 15, sleeping on a cousin's couch bed because his parents' house had no heat after the furnace broke and they couldn't afford to fix it. He remembered exactly what it felt like to say, "I'll figure something out," when you had already run through every option and come up empty. He did something that surprised even himself. "There's a shelter on Church Street," he said. "Oh, good one. I know the director. I can call ahead if you want." Ada looked at him for a long time. "I've been to shelters," she said simply. He understood what that meant, too. He thought about it on the drive home. He thought about it in his apartment on the 28th floor, looking out at the city lights. He thought about it when he woke at 2 in the morning, which he often did, in the way of people who have too many unresolved things running quietly in the background of their minds. By morning he had called the shelter on Church Street then 2 others, then a social worker named Brennan who had helped him with a corporate charitable initiative 3 years ago and whose card he'd kept without knowing exactly why. Brennan called back within the hour. "I know the girl," she said. "Ada Ose, 11 years old. Her mother passed in August, ovarian cancer, very fast. No father listed on the birth record. She was placed with a foster family in Scarborough, but it wasn't a good situation and she left." A pause. "She's been managing on her own for about 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Theodore sat with that. "What happens now?" he asked. "She goes back into care. There's a process. It takes time." He thought about the way Ada had counted her change, the way she'd said, "I'll figure something out," the way she'd thanked him, simply without drama, like someone who had already accepted that this was all they were going to get. "What if I wanted to help more directly?" he said. "Through the right channels. Whatever the proper process is." Brennan was quiet for a moment. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I'm asking what the options are." The options, as it turned out, were complicated. They involved home assessments and background checks and references and court dates, and a social worker named Gemma Adler, who had a brisk manner and absolutely no interest in being impressed by Theodore Marsh's address or his company's annual report. She asked him in their first meeting why he wanted to pursue emergency foster placement at 61 years old with no prior experience of children. He told her about the restaurant, about Ada counting her change, about 6 weeks. Gemma Adler wrote something in her notebook. Her expression didn't change. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "a lot of people feel moved by encounters like that. Most of them don't follow through. Of the ones who do, a significant number find the reality is much harder than they expected." She looked at him steadily. "What makes you think you're different?" He didn't have a clean answer. "I'm not sure I am," he said, "but I'd like the chance to find out." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'll need to speak with the child," she said. Ada, when asked, said she didn't know the man, but she said it in a way that was careful, not dismissive. She said she thought he seemed like a serious person. She said, unprompted, that he hadn't tried to make her feel like a charity case, which was what most people did, even when they were trying to be kind. Coming from an 11-year-old who had been assessing adults her whole life, Gemma Adler noted, that was a fairly significant endorsement. It was not simple. Nothing about the weeks that followed was simple. Theodore's apartment was assessed and found suitable. His references were checked. His finances were reviewed. His neighbors were interviewed. He attended a mandatory training weekend in a community center in North York with 7 other prospective foster parents, most of them half his age, and he sat through sessions on trauma-informed care and attachment theory and felt, for the first time in many years, genuinely out of his depth. He didn't mention this to anyone at his company, not to his assistant, Helen, who had been with him for 19 years and who noticed everything, not to his board, not to his oldest friend, Stuart Pennell, who was retired and lived in Kelowna and called every few weeks to talk about hockey and complain about real estate prices. He wasn't sure how to explain it. He wasn't sure he needed to explain it yet. Ada came to stay on a Tuesday with a social worker and a single backpack. She stood in the foyer of his apartment, looked around at the high ceilings and the view of the lake and the general evidence of a life lived entirely without children, and said nothing. He showed her the room he'd prepared. It was the guest room, repainted a soft gray-green at Helen's suggestion, with a new desk and a lamp, and a set of bookshelves he'd stocked somewhat randomly, not knowing what she liked. She looked at the bookshelves for a long moment. "You have Anne of Green Gables," she said. "My assistant chose most of them," he admitted. "She has good taste," Ada said. He made pasta for dinner because it was the one thing he was confident he could do without embarrassing himself. She ate 2 servings and asked if he had any parmesan. He did not, which led to a brief silence, and then she said that was okay. She'd just been asking, and he wrote parmesan on the magnetic notepad on the fridge in handwriting that was slightly more deliberate than usual. She noticed. "You're not used to this," she said. It wasn't an accusation. "No," he said. "Are you?" She thought about it. "I'm used to different versions of not knowing what's going to happen," she said. He thought that was one of the more precise things he'd heard anyone say, at any age. The first 2 weeks were careful and quiet. Ada was self-sufficient in ways that came, he understood, from necessity rather than nature. She made her own breakfast, managed her own homework, kept her room more organized than most adults he'd met. She was not a difficult child. She was a careful one. She had nightmares. He heard her sometimes, 2 or 3 in the morning, the kind of dreaming that breaks through the surface and makes sounds. He didn't know what to do. He stood outside her door twice before deciding the third time to knock softly and ask if she was all right. She opened the door. Her hair was loose, and she had the slightly blank look of someone pulled back from somewhere difficult. "Sorry," she said. "Did I wake you?" "I was already up," he said, which was partly true. He made tea. He sat at the kitchen table. She sat across from him, wrapping her hands around the mug, and eventually she said, "I used to hear my mom moving around the apartment at night. After she got sick, she couldn't sleep much." He didn't say anything. He let it sit. "I think that's why I wake up," she said. "I got used to listening." They sat in the kitchen until nearly 4 o'clock. He told her because he couldn't think of what else to offer, about the year the furnace broke, about sleeping on his cousin's couch, about being 15 and lying awake, wondering when things would stop being hard. She listened the way she did everything, carefully, without interrupting. "Did they?" she asked. "Stop being hard?" "They changed," he said. "That's maybe more accurate." She seemed to consider this as a satisfactory answer. They went back to bed shortly after, and she slept through until morning. The complication arrived 6 weeks later, in the form of a woman named Rosalind Thei. Theodore had never heard Ada mention an aunt. Neither, apparently, had Gemma Adler's file, which had not recorded any living relatives. But Rosalind Thei arrived at the offices of Children's Aid with documentation, claiming she was Ada's mother's younger sister, and that she should have been contacted immediately upon her sister's death, and that she wanted custody. Theodore heard about it from Gemma Adler, who called him at 8 in the morning, her professional briskness carrying a note of something more careful. "Has Ada ever mentioned her?" he asked. "No," Gemma said. "Does Ada know?" "Not yet." He drove Ada to school himself that morning, which he'd started doing on the days his schedule allowed. They listened to the radio in a comfortable silence they had by now developed a practiced ease with. He told her that afternoon, when she was settled with a snack and her homework. He said it plainly, because he'd learned she didn't like to be managed or softened at. Ada sat very still. "My mom never talked about her," she said. "Not once. Do you know why?" Ada looked at the table. "There were things in our family that my mom didn't talk about," she said finally. "I don't know all of it." He said he understood, and that whatever happened, she would be spoken to before any decisions were made. She looked up at him. "Do I have to go?" she asked. Her voice was careful, controlled, the voice of someone who had learned to ask questions without letting on how much the answer mattered. "Not without your say," he said. "Not if I can help it." Rosalind Thei was 43, well-dressed and articulate. She had, she said, been living in Vancouver for the past 7 years, which was why there had been no contact. She had lost touch with her sister during a difficult period in the family, she said, and learning of the death had been devastating. She hadn't known about Ada's situation until a family friend had reached out. Theodore's solicitor, a careful woman named Doris Hannah, sat across from Rosalind Thei's lawyer in a mediator's office on Bay Street and took notes. Afterward, Doris said, "She may be genuine, or she may have heard that a significant estate could be involved." Ada's mother had not had money, but a man named Theodore Marsh being connected to her daughter was, apparently, information that had traveled. He had Doris look into it. He asked for documentation, proof of the family connection, photographs, any correspondence. He asked, quietly, through the right channels, for a DNA verification to be pursued. Rosalind Thei agreed, without much hesitation, which either meant she was confident or that she had decided to call any bluff. Ada, when the process was explained to her by Gemma Adler, said, "I understand." Then she said, "Can I ask Mr. Marsh to come to the appointment with me?" He came. The waiting was in some ways harder than the conflict. 3 weeks for the results. Theodore went to work and ran his company and sat at his corner table at the Bloor Street restaurant on Thursday evenings, and things looked from the outside exactly as they always had. Internally, he was aware of something he hadn't expected, a realignment of what mattered. The numbers on his quarterly reports were the same numbers they had always been. They felt like less than they used to. Ada made it to school every day. She got an 87 on a history project about the Métis people and left it on the kitchen counter, face up, in a way that was casual but not accidental. He looked at it, then looked at her and said, "This is excellent." She kept eating breakfast at the counter. "I know," she said, but her ear tips went pink the way they did when she was pleased. He laughed. It surprised him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed alone in his kitchen. The results arrived on a Wednesday morning. Rosalind Osei was not related to Ada by blood. Gemma Adler called first, then Doris, then the mediator's office. It emerged eventually, through documentation Doris dug up, that Rosalind had been a childhood friend of Ada's mother. Close enough once to be called almost family. Whether the claim had been pursued out of grief or out of interest in Theodore's association with Ada, it was impossible to say. Theodore chose not to pursue it further. Doris thought this was probably wise. He told Ada that evening. He sat down at the kitchen table and told her clearly, without softening, what the results had been. Ada listened. Her face went through several things quickly. "She really wasn't family?" she asked. "No." A silence. "My mom didn't have sisters," Ada said finally, quietly. "I always knew that. She used to say she came from a family of only children." She looked at the table. "I don't know why I didn't say that sooner." "Maybe you weren't sure enough," he said. She nodded. That seemed right to her. "What happens now?" she asked. "That," he said, "is actually something I wanted to talk to you about." He had met with Gemma Adler the previous week. He had met with his own solicitor, and with a family law specialist Doris had recommended. He had also finally told Stuart Pennell in Kelowna, who had been uncharacteristically quiet for several seconds before saying, "Ted, you should have told me months ago." He had also told Helen, who had cried a little, and then immediately begun researching the requirements for long-term foster care and eventual adoption, which was exactly what Theodore had hoped she would do. "There's a longer process," he said to Ada. "If it's something you'd want, it would mean staying, more permanently." Ada looked at him. She had, over the past month, stopped holding herself quite so still in his presence. She sat now the way children sit, slightly sideways in the chair, her feet not quite reaching the floor. "Would you want that?" she asked. He thought about the notebook on the fridge, the Parmesan that was now always in the refrigerator, the sound of her moving around the apartment in the morning, the history project left face up on the counter, the 4 o'clock kitchen conversations, which had happened now more times than he could count. "Yes," he said, "very much." Ada looked at her hands for a moment, then she looked back up. "I'd want that too," she said. She said it quietly, with the same careful precision she brought to everything, but her chin lifted slightly when she said it, like someone who had finally, after a long time, decided to take up a little more space. Winter came early to Toronto that year. By late November, the lake was rough and gray, and the cold came in off the water and got into the buildings the way it does when you're far enough north. Theodore had never much minded winter. He'd grown up in it. On a Saturday morning, he came into the kitchen to find Ada already awake, standing at the window with a mug of hot chocolate. She'd worked out how to use the machine without asking, which he was choosing to take as a positive sign, looking out at the snow that had been falling since midnight. "It's really coming down," she said. "It does that here," he said. She turned around. She had her serious face on, the one she got when she was thinking through something carefully. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "can I ask you something?" He took out the coffee beans. "Yes. Why did you help me that first night?" She wasn't looking away. People don't usually. He thought about it honestly, about the furnace and the couch and being 15, about all the Thursdays in that corner table, and how uncomplicated the life had looked from the outside and how quiet it had been on the inside. "Because you asked plainly," he said, "and because I knew what it meant that you were asking." She thought about that. "Okay," she said. She seemed to find it sufficient. She turned back to the window. He started the coffee. Outside, the snow kept falling over the city, steady and indifferent and soft, covering everything evenly, the way snow does, not distinguishing between the rich and the quiet, and the ones who had learned early to need as little as possible. In the kitchen, the coffee machine ran, and Ada stood at the window, and Theodore Marsh began, for the first time in a very long while, to feel like someone was home.